Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, one data point for you all this week, that is to say one topic in general. That data point is 112, as in 112%. That is the percentage of GDP of France's public debt. That's well above the EU's Maastricht target of 60%. And it's the attempt to reduce that debt that led to the collapse of the latest French government.
France's prime minister is resigning today after losing a vote of confidence in parliament. Francois Bayrou called the vote himself in a last-ditch effort to get his budget plan passed.
President Emmanuel Macron tapping the current Minister of Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu, to lead the country just hours after the toppled PM Francois Bayrou handed in.
That makes for 5 prime ministers in the past several years in France. And the collapse of that government is one of several dramatic events, dramatic developments happening in various European countries. We've talked a lot about the United States in recent weeks here on the podcast. We've also talked about America's relationship with Europe, trade relationship, the deal they struck. But we haven't taken a look at the domestic politics in Europe recently, and so we thought we'd sort of survey various European countries and the turbulences most of them seem to find themselves in right now. We'll talk about France, then we'll come to Germany and Britain. But yeah, the most dramatic events, it's fair to say, have been in France, where, as I mentioned, the government of Prime Minister Francois Bayrou collapsed, and it collapsed over his proposed budget. It was essentially a type of austerity budget. And he knew that the budget would fail. It almost seemed like the vote on the budget was almost meant to set up a dramatic final speech he gave in Parliament. In that speech, he sort of declared towards the end that I found this quote very dramatic. He said, "Domination by military force or domination by our creditors as a result of debts that drown us produces the same result, the loss of our liberty." So, Adam, I wanted to sort of ask you to assess that quote. I mean, first, just on the empirical sense of, you know, how severe are France's debt problems as a whole? And then second, this linkage that Bayrou is making between, you know, foreign economic debt or economic debt of the state and, almost a kind of loss of national liberty, analogous almost to military defeat. I mean, how do you make sense of that rhetoric overall?
Well, the rhetoric comes from the era of the Eurozone crisis 10 years ago now, when that kind of statement would not really have been an exaggeration in describing the situation of an Ireland or a Greece, and to a lesser extent a Spain, a Portugal, and even Italy, which was under massive pressure during that time. And during the Eurozone crisis, and this is the essential backdrop to the entire French drama at this point, France separated itself from Spain and Italy in terms of the positioning of its debt, and French government debt became a substitute for German government debt. There was need of a substitute because there wasn't any German government debt to buy, because the German government adopted a really hardcore budget balance policy in 2009, which really bit in the 2010s. And so investors who actually need debt to buy, right? This is the key thing about public debt. It's actually an asset which society needs, European society as much as any other. There wasn't enough German debt, and so people were buying oats, they're so-called. This is the French treasuries. And what we're seeing now is that alignment of France with Germany is breaking down, and French debt is being traded much more like Italian or Spanish debt. And that's really the cause of this crisis and all of this very dramatic talk in Parliament. The numbers, as you suggest, are large. The estimates vary depending on which measure you're using. The highest number I've seen is 116% currently. That is French public debt as a share of GDP. The trend is inexorably upwards. It's not surging in a spectacular rate. We're not talking about an entirely broken fiscal system by any means. The tax rate in France is high. but it's well above European norms, and it's starkly upwards since 2019. So French debt as a share of GDP was around 100% for most of the 2010s. And since 2019 and the COVID crisis, the ability to bring the budget even with remotely close to balance has broken down. And so this is why we're seeing this rapid increase. So they've added about €1 trillion worth of debt since 2019. The markets, it has to be said, have had no problem absorbing this because, to reiterate, there just isn't enough German government debt out there. And people are a bit leery about buying Italian or Spanish debt. You see that in the borrowing costs that France currently pays on 10-year debt. France pays 3.47% interest. Now, that's a lot higher than Germany, which pays 2.66%. But it's much lower than the United States, which pays 4.08%, and much lower than the UK, which pays 4.6%. So this really has to be put in perspective. There is a huge drama going on in France, but essentially it's a political drama around the question of the long-run budget balance and the ability of French politicians, the French parliament, the French electorate ultimately, but also French civil society, because this is still a country in which labor unions play an absolutely fundamental role in politics, to organize themselves to redress this imbalance. Now, you can live, if you're the United States, without doing anything about this. All of these numbers are way worse for America. The trends are worse. The budget deficit is bigger. America pays higher interest rates. But America also is a monetary sovereign. And not only that, it's the reserve currency of the world. France is part of the Eurozone system and subject to serious external constraint and scrutiny. Would the ECB, ultimately, that's the European Central Bank, hang the French out to dry? No way. That's not happening. But France doesn't have the kind of autonomy that the US does. The fundamental question here is political, and that's what the Prime Minister is trying to amp up the pressure over. He's trying to say to the French Parliament, I made this point in a piece in the New York Times a while back, like the fundamental essence of political sovereignty is your ability to regulate your budget. And if you can't get that done, then you really are forfeiting your status as a sovereign. They couldn't get the budget done this summer. You're absolutely right that this was a foregone conclusion because there were negotiations with the socialists, who are the swing vote. We'll say more about, I think, the electoral composition in a minute. And the socialists themselves are very heavily influenced by the trade unions. And the other really big issue on the French political agenda now for years is the pension reform program, which Macron, the president, pushed through with hardline measures in 2023, and the French left is still smarting over this, and negotiations over a compromise on the pensions broke down this summer over employer intransigence, which then caused the unions to walk away, which meant the socialists couldn't compromise. And that's why we're in this situation that we're in right now. But it's about politics, first and foremost, rather than an immediate fiscal crisis. Even the IMF, which has looked at this, has said, there's no risk of anything happening here in short term. In debt markets, there's going to be liquidity, there's going to be demand for French assets. Down the line, it could change a little bit because the Germans are going to issue quite a lot of debt. But nevertheless, I don't think there's no prospect with these kind of numbers of an immediate financial disaster.
It does make it seem like this is an interesting exercise in rhetoric. I mean, there's almost the claim of enfeeblement is itself like an instrument here in trying to move the politics, obviously. But yeah, it's interesting that the word euro doesn't seem to come up here, and that the role of this kind of external European Central Bank as this important actor here, which, seems to play a decisive role here. It's sort of not in France's control entirely what's going to happen. But I guess, the mainstream politicians, interestingly skirt mentioning that, I guess. But I guess that brings us to the president who appointed Bayrou in the first place and his various predecessors in the previous few years, namely President Emmanuel Macron. He is still in office, although calls are percolating that he should resign. And basically the impasse that French politics now finds itself in, with a parliament that can't even pass a budget, is being blamed on Macron himself. I'm curious how we should now be assessing Macron overall. I mean, is it fair to say at this point that Macron is a failure? I mean, to the extent he had a project, it seemed to be, consolidating centrism as a new kind of ideology and basically opposing extremist ideologies on the edges. But now the result seems to be that the conditions for centrism have kind of been destroyed during Macron's term, and France is actually looking at a much more extremist political landscape in his wake. So, I mean, is Macronism a failure overall?
Well, I mean, first of all, to put the political turmoil in perspective, I think President Macron, over his 2 5-year terms, has so far had 7 prime ministers. But that's not, the prime minister is for the president to appoint and dismiss. He needs a parliamentary majority. What's really unusual is that Macron has now lost 2 prime ministers because of lack of parliamentary confidence. And that had only previously happened once in the history of the French Fifth Republic since 1958, which, the Fifth Republic came into existence in the middle of the Algerian crisis. It was designed around the figure of de Gaulle. It was supposed to be this powerful presidential body. And we've ended up with something which is much more like a kind of division of powers model. And Macron has ended up losing 2 prime ministers in short succession. So this is it's not quite a constitutional crisis, but it's kind of getting there. And certainly if you read the French commentary, I was reading Le Monde this morning ahead of our conversation, and the recurring phrase there is powerlessness, drift, vacuum, wasteland, a kind of, a story of disempowerment. But I think it's also important to sort of, get one's theory of Macron right. And, I don't think we have a settled view on this yet, but there was one version which was really very conservative, which was that Macron, when he was elected in 2017, it was already a moment of extreme tension because, Donald Trump's elected in 2016, Brexit goes through, Europe in early 2017 is really afraid of the, avalanche of populism. The right wing was dominating in Poland, and Macron sails through, but it was nail-biting at the time, right? Because already then French politics was polarized on the left around Jean-Luc Mélenchon and on the right around Le Pen and the French far right. And Macron emerged as this savior. And one reading was that he was, the golden boy of a reassertion of neoliberalism. He came from an investment banking background, the whole shtick. He looks the part. And that reading, I think works up to a point. And in that case, you would have to say that, he's failed to restore normality. But if you listen to Macron himself, that's really not the story he tells about himself. I mean, the story he prefers is wake up, smell the coffee. We're in a world of antagonism, of power, of sovereignty, of history, of politics as such, right? Not just doing politics, but the political has come back. These are the rhetorics that he likes. And if you look at his term in office, it's after all marked by, really profound upheaval. I mean, the crisis in America in 2020 with COVID and Black Lives Matter and the constitutional crisis around Trump was major. But France has been through that, plus Gilets jaunes in 2018, absolutely massive protests around both the pensions and the police killing, their version of Black Lives Matter, the police killing of a black youth in 2023, the Ukraine crisis, which of course affects Europe much more than it does the United States. This has been a presidency dominated by actionism, if you like. So rather than thinking of Macron as a failed effort to restore the unpolitical of neoliberalism, right, the reform agenda, quote unquote, we could think of him as a politician who self-consciously positioned himself as a man of history. And then the question is, what's he achieved? You could say that he has pushed through pension reform at huge cost to French politics. You could say that he's quite doggedly pursued an environmental agenda, at least up until quite recently, in the face of mass protest. But what he lacks, and this is the key thing, is simply majorities. And if you then ask, is the French political scene more radical now than it was in 2017? I'm not sure quite what your answer would be, to be honest, because Le Pen has done her level best to remove some of the truly fascist skinhead fangs of the French far right and to try and establish them as a party more in the mode of, say, a Meloni, who, also sort of morphed, right, from the post-fascism of the Fratelli d'Italia to, this sort of right-wing nationalist pivot, really, of transatlantic relations. That's in Italy. And on the left, sure, there's Mélenchon, but the kingmakers of the current scene in France are the socialists, in an odd resumption of centrality, which they really lost when their president, François Hollande, the guy who did the Paris Climate Conference of 2015, when he was humiliated and the French socialists collapsed in the 2017 election. They're back as a key king-making power in the current moment. And there's a kind of way in which it isn't just a sort of a standard story of a radical centrism producing more polarization, as it's almost kind of a stubborn refusal of the Macronites to think seriously about the need essentially to form a coalition with the left, with the socialists, which they suborned in the first phase of Macron's period in office. And now that really, they're staring down the barrel of needing to do that deal. And by all accounts, the new choice of prime minister, who's this wunderkind, late 30s, ex-defense minister, very, very close ally of Macron, is a man who may be able to do that deal. I think most of the French commentators that I trust on the current situation are perplexed to a degree by the failure of the Macron centrists to wake up, smell the coffee, and recognize that the only direction they can really go in is towards some kind of opening towards the left, which is there and it's willing to govern. And there are fissures within the new Popular Front, which the Macronites could easily exploit so as to isolate Mélenchon and do deals with other members of that coalition. And there's a real, I think, tactical puzzlement about the failure to go in that direction. And some people will say, well, then actually maybe Macron is really deep down not a centrist, not a neoliberal, but actually a man of the authoritarian side of French politics. And he's, after all, given plenty of demonstrations of that. I mean, people were killed in the repression of the Gilets jaunes, right? This was a massive exercise of state force. Thousands of people were injured by the police. It was a really brutal exercise in state power. For the protests that were timed for the 10th of September, which is our day of recording, Macron promised to mobilize 80,000 police. Like, this was a huge repressive effort. And again, from that point of view, you judge him differently, right? So this idea of Macron as a failure depends on your initial assumption about what he's about. And I think there's at least three different versions. He's actually really a rightist wolf in sheep's clothing. That's one option. He's a man of history who struggles with the tactics as forming majorities. Or maybe he is indeed like the last gasp of a neoliberalism, which is just being buffeted by historical forces. I think it's not fully played out yet. We don't quite know how this story ends.
I mean, I would say that, one of the things Macron seems to have done, one of his effective actions has been to kind of like destroy or really disrupt the existing party system in France without really replacing the existing mainstream parties with an effective force of his own. And I think there is a kind of chaos that we've seen being left behind as a result of that. And I do agree with you that the sort of like second option that you laid out is, I think, Macron's self-image of him trying to be a man of history and trying to make sure that France can be an effective actor in history at this time. But yeah, it does seem like observing these kinds of changes in the world are not the same thing as being an effective actor. And when you have this kind of domestic political chaos, it seems it's more like you have a lot of interviews that Macron gives with very sort of trenchant insights about the world without really having created an effective actor that can participate in these changes. But yeah, to shift to Germany. Germany has had a new government now for several months under the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And after passing several laws in the early going, including a loosening of debt restrictions, Merz is now promising an autumn of reforms in which essentially he's promising an austerity agenda of his own. He has one quote here in which he essentially says that Germany's welfare state as it currently exists cannot be financed by Germany's own economy. And so clearly he's looking for cutbacks. And amid this discussion in Germany is a lot of kind of citations of Gerhard Schröder's Agenda 2010 from about 20 years ago, in which he famously passed these Hartz reforms that reduced the welfare state. I wanted to ask Adam whether this is a kind of apt analogy or an apt precedent to be drawing on. I mean, clearly Germany's economy did boom after that Agenda 2010, but that clearly wasn't only on the back of domestic reforms, but really China's rise and its demand for German exports. So should Germany be looking back to a different time in its history instead of Gerhard Schröder's agenda from 20 years ago? Is there a time that Germany could look back to that would be more apt? When maybe domestic consumption was stronger and providing more of a motor for its economy? Should we be going back further than the 2000s, more to the 90s or 80s? Or what should Germany be looking back to at all?
Yeah, this is a very interesting, complicated story of political memory. And for our American listeners, it's, maybe one can map this onto the way in which, say, the Democrats relate to the history of the Clinton presidency in the 90s, or the Republicans to the Reagan presidency of the 80s, the Brits to Tony Blair. So Germany has this narrative of itself as going through these phases of, dynamism and prosperity and self-satisfaction, complacency, a sense of themselves as being a kind of a model, and then phases of stagnation and impasse and what they call blockierte Gesellschaft, so blocked society. And those different passages that you've spoken about, Cam, kind of address this. So coming out of the 1980s, West Germany was a strong economy. It wasn't growing rapidly. It was growing about 2% per annum, but it was the strongest European economy, dominant within what was then the merging as the project of European Monetary Union and Western Europe. And then the wall falls in 89, and West Germany mounts this gigantic effort, physical, material, economic, social, financial, in every respect, to incorporate East Germany. And it's gigantic. Even, by modern standards, we think they spent between about 1.3 and 1.6 trillion euros between 1991 and 2003. So that's the kind of spending that the Merz coalition is contemplating right now to revive Germany. So there you already have the analogy. And that produced a giant boom. So growth accelerated from 2 to 5% per annum in the early 1990s, and then a slump as that initial spending unwound. And then a crisis or a sustained period of stagnation as the unemployment and deindustrialization in Eastern Germany hit, as other parts of Eastern Europe were more competitive than East Germany in the newly integrated European economy, and as the German social welfare system internalized and sort of cannibalized itself as it absorbed the costs of essentially restructuring an entire country, East Germany. And that led in the late 90s to this diagnosis of Germany as the sick man of Europe, and the idea that Germany was a kind of blocked society, unable to move forward, unable to find the majorities for radical reform. And it's that to which the Red-Green coalition, so that's the first government that had brought the Greens into power in Germany at the national level with the Social Democrats. And they, in a very dramatic series of moves in 2003, pushed through swinging cuts to the German social insurance system and the liberalization of the bottom end of the labor market, which produced an awful lot of very low-paid jobs, and the mobilization of a relatively underemployed labor force in the 1990s into the 2000s. And by the 2010s, or as recently as a few years ago, this was subsequently anathematized as Germany's Thatcherite moment, as, like Clinton's welfare reforms or incarceration regime of the 90s are now commonly seen on the American left as, the moment where the German left went wrong. So it's really telling that it should be coming back now as an example. I gather Schröder is, in fact, who's generally seen as a completely discredited figure because of his, his very close relationship with Putin and his position on Gazprom and so on, has come back and endorsed these proposals. So really the times they are changing. But that produced a sort of opening at the bottom end of the German labour market, huge surge of inequality, huge increase in employment rates. And then, as you say, on top of that came the China boost. Germany went from exporting a couple of billion euros worth of goods to China every year to exporting about 50 billion by the 2010s, and then 60, 70 billion by the mid-2010s. Chinese exports to China went from 1% of German exports to 7% of German exports. Germany at the time was the world export champion, so we're talking about really large numbers. Economists think that it drove an increase in German growth of maybe as much as half a percentage point. So if German growth in the late 90s was 1% and it went to closer to 2% in the 2000s, a very substantial share of that was coming from these extra exports to China, because what was China buying? It was buying German cars in part, but it was also buying German machine tools. Essentially, Germany and China do the same middle high-tech manufacturing stuff. And so the Chinese wanted to learn from the Germans, and there was a major benefit for the German industry from that boom. And it's exhausted itself. And the crisis of Germany in the current moment, and this is Merz and the SPD have been struggling with this now from the very beginning. The previous government was as well. The German industrial model, though leading in Europe, and other countries in Europe have it even worse, but the German industrial model is facing really very severe long-term strategic challenges when faced with the emergence of China now as, in its second phase as a super high-tech manufacturing hub. It's no longer doing the cheap stuff. It's outsourcing that. It's in this, it's really kind of full spectrum dominance in practically every area except the ultra high-tech areas of manufacturing is now in China. That puts Germany in a really difficult position. They're out of historical analogies, to be absolutely honest. I don't know why anyone would want to revive that 2000s agenda. You'd think of it as a quite mixed political legacy, but they must be desperately scraping the barrel. I mean, the good news from the point of view of the German economy is that the spending that they're talking about is gigantic. If you look at it in historical terms, it's at least at the level of the German reunification boom. So in the short run, it's headed in the right direction. They're spending the right kind of money. This talk about the German welfare state being unsustainable, it's even less serious in terms of any kind of short or medium-term pressure than the French talk about a fiscal crisis. It's part of, I believe, the political bargain that Merz had to make with his own party to get the first wave of changes done that they've done. So it's Merz is quite a hard right kind of character. He's not a populist, but he's a die in the wool conservative. He may indeed want to strip back various bits of the German welfare state, but it's not out of any immediate necessity or any serious malfunction in the German labor market, like in the late 90s. Like, the Germans are desperately short of skilled labor in every single corner. Like, this is not a country that is, in a state of malaise in that sense. It has a long run growth strategy issue, but this is the kind of politics that you need in a coalition like the one he's running.
Yeah, I mean, I should have mentioned, this is all happening against the background of slower growth. In fact, kind of, I think, no growth in recent
recession.
Quarter.
I mean, they've been in and out of recession. They've been bouncing around on the edge of recession now for several years.
Yeah, I think like practically since the pandemic, there's been no growth.
They have not recovered strongly from the pandemic. It's a very unusual phase, and it does, I think, reflect this loss of export markets because it isn't domestic. If you look at the German macro numbers, the German domestic economy is not doing badly, but it's exports which are not in fine fettle.
Yeah, and the labor market seems to be doing fine. It's not like
just fine.
Unemployment.
Yeah. Last thing they need is any more. I mean, they if they're going to do a big aggregate demand push, they need to invest very heavily in the supply side, because otherwise they're not going to be able to. It's going to be difficult to actually implement any of the big plans they have in mind, which is not a bad thing, right? Having demand side pressure to make supply side change. That's the way you want to do it. You're in a real pickle when you have to do the supply side change to get things going. That isn't Germany's issue. They're going to have the demand, and that then obviously creates the opportunities for reskilling, for bringing more people into the labor market, for absorbing migrants. It's all good. So the shame, in a sense, is that a conservative government like Merz's has to sell this as an opportunity for painful cuts to the welfare state.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, sure enough, rather than this kind of bigger strategic discussion, it is a discussion happening right now about cutting the welfare state and improving competitiveness in that sort of classic sense. And yeah, it seems like anything is up for debate in terms of these promised reforms this autumn. There's talk of cutting welfare payments, cutting family policy payments, maybe cutbacks in health care, etc. The one thing that is not really up for debate in this coalition is cuts to old age pensions. I mean, the CDU talks about different ideas, but the SPD has made it clear that that's going to be off the table. And so, yeah, it does seem like senior citizens are the most powerful constituency in Germany. And I'm curious what we should sort of conclude about this. Just from a political economy perspective, where does this head and how does this shape, politics going forward?
Yeah, Germany, like many other countries in Europe and East Asia, is a rapidly aging society. So in the most recent election, 42%, I think, of the electorate were over the age of 60. Yeah, that's worth thinking about. Like 42%, almost a quarter were over the age of 70, 23%. That's compared to 13% under the age of 30. It is a massively skewed electorate. And, back in 1990, at the time of reunification, the share of those over 60 was only 27%. So there's a very dramatic shift going on. And this is compounded by the fact that older people tend to vote more. So their participation rates are much higher. They're like closer to 75%. Very, very high by American standards in any case, but very high levels of voter participation. And that does, as you were saying, bias a political system in the direction of pensioner votes. And the Social Democratic Party, which you alluded to, they're the junior party in this coalition with Merz. They used to be the senior party in the previous German government, which we've talked about a lot on the show, the so-called traffic light coalition, right, which was the SPD red, the Liberals yellow, and the Greens green. We're now in a black-red coalition with the Conservatives, CDU, being black. That's not because they're fascist. That's because they're Catholic originally, right? So priests wear black. So in German color coding of politics, they're a black-red coalition. And the Social Democrats are the junior coalition partner, but they have a lot of the most important positions in government, like finance and defense. And their electorate is overwhelmingly older people. But what is also true, if you look at, in depth at what older Germans actually want, it's quite a mixed bag, right? The nasty voters right now are the young people, the far right. Also, it should be said, lots of young women vote for the left in a kind of a backlash of their own against the misogyny of the far right and the failure of the centrist parties to really answer that. But older voters are, if you like, they are literally the older voters, principally of West Germany. And their preferences are, if I may say so, kind of sensible. And so, though it's true, obviously, that turkeys aren't going to vote for Christmas, it's nevertheless the case that they support a fairly wide bandwidth of social policy spending. Like, old people have grandchildren and they care about grandchildren. And if you look at the balance of German social spending, it is skewed somewhat to the older side. That's true of welfare states all over the world. But compared to other rich countries, for instance, the skew is less bad in Germany than it is in many, many other rich countries. In Italy, it's absolutely appalling. It's pretty bad in France too. And if you look at the spending profile on young people in Germany, and this matters so much, right? Because spending on old people can, if I may be permitted to say so, be described as unproductive because people have retired. Spending on young people really matters because that's an investment in the future and their future productivity. And every single study in the world shows that the younger you spend the money, the better the rates of return, right? So if you spend money on a 1 or a 2-year-old, you get a much higher rate of return than if you spend it on a teenager. And so ideally, what you see in public spending on young people is a huge skew into early childhood. And Germany is amongst one of the standout cases of rich countries, which actually does have precisely the skew you would want in the ideal case, right? It's up there with the Swedens, the Austrias. It does better than France. And it's in a completely different universe from the US, which has an emerging market or low income skew against young children. Like it's utterly dysfunctional in the US. So my point here is demography is not destiny, right? Demography is not destiny. Sure, older people are not going to vote to have their pensions slashed, but does having an older population necessarily mean that you end up with an irresponsible, idiotic, totally dysfunctional welfare spending plan? Absolutely not. And German democracy doesn't show that pattern. And so, I think there's this, and it's a big bit of a campaign for me. Like, there's so much political science and political economy which is ultimately profoundly skeptical about the rationality of democracy, right? Because in the end, what would you expect? Selfish voters, give them the chance, of course, they'll vote for more tensions. Like, actually, people aren't like that, right? People are actually more complicated, and politicians are more complicated. And the German case demonstrates this. We don't have chronic deficits in Germany, which a certain sort of banal public choice economics would predict. Germany has surpluses quite a lot of the time and really low public debts. And despite its aging population, it has a pretty close to ideal spending pattern in terms of the skew of spending overall. If you look at the OECD comparisons, I'm sure there's room for improvement, and campaigners in Germany will tell me I'm sugarcoating this, but you look at the OECD numbers, and if you're raising a kid, you want to be raising a kid in Germany and not not in the vast majority of the rest of the world.
Well, yeah, I'd endorse that last point, having had the comparative experience myself with the U.S. But yeah, I wonder whether the demographic questions do also skew the visions at work, like the kind of political ideologies that get produced. Because even, no doubt your description of the spending is correct, but there is something sort of palpable about some kind of lack of kind of forward-looking vision about what like the energy is not sort of directed in some way towards the future always, and certainly not, I feel like, from the SPD in the ways you were sort of alluding to. It does seem sort of somehow more conservative, even if it's.
But don't you think? I mean, I agree with you. I think that we both spent time mulling over the lack of energy, but. Trump's an old guy, and the one thing you can't say about him is he lacks vision, right? Age by itself does not, and it's not necessarily a good thing, right? Like, so I'm not sure that age in a straightforward way correlates. I think the specific politics in a multi-party system like the German one of the SPD as a bastion of, defense of welfare rights for a sectional older interest of electorate, it's very uninspiring. I agree. I mean, I don't disagree with you there, but I don't think it's it's a necessary effect of aging that you end up with that kind of politics.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting to sort of observe how social democracy has itself changed.
Maybe that's the thing we're saying. It's like social democracy does seem to have aged.
We're going to take a quick break right here, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about the turbulence across Europe. Well, that actually gives a nice segue in terms of bringing us to Britain, which we also wanted to talk about, and the struggles of the Labour Party government there, led by Keir Starmer. It's been in office a bit longer than a year, but it really seems to have taken what was a very large majority in Parliament and sort of catastrophically lost support in the past year. It's now only at 22% approval for Starmer's government. That's produced recently various shakeups in the cabinet, including the resignation of Starmer's deputy prime minister. Yeah, I guess in some general sense, I wanted to ask how Starmer blew this so badly and so quickly, exactly. I mean, I wonder whether this has to do with Starmer's own ideology, which seems to be a kind of managerialism, like a kind of almost anti-ideology in terms of how to manage a country. And is there just a kind of fundamental mismatch between Starmer's managerial kind of outlook and the extent of Britain's problems? I mean, in some sense, he reminds me of Olaf Scholz in Germany, who had a kind of struggles of his own in Germany, rather than someone else in Britain's past in terms of the Labour Party, Tony Blair, who I guess had problems of its own, but I guess couldn't be accused of not having a vision in terms of running the government.
Yeah, I mean, it has been awful to watch. And I think, in a way, the comparison to the last government in Germany is rather uncharitable to the Germans in the, as you were saying, given the British first past the post system and the enormous revulsion across a large part of British society against the succession of increasingly corrupt and incompetent and just towards the end, just laughable Tory governments. Starmer had a huge groundswell of support. And looking at the demography of it, it wasn't like the SPD support, right? So the British Labour Party still actually sort of looked like a classic social democratic coalition. It had some working class votes. It had a lot of young people voting for it, because who else do you vote for in a first past the post system when your option are the Tories, essentially, and when you have to, in some senses, get revenge for the disaster of Brexit. And the whole thing yields a gigantic majority in Parliament for one party, quite unlike the incredibly difficult coalition that Olaf Scholz and his team had to manage. So that you end up comparing the two is like testament to just how badly wrong this has gone. And it's gone spectacularly wrong, right? According to latest opinion polling, Starmer is amongst the least popular politicians in the world, within British society in terms of his net negatives. He's about 4 times less popular than Trump, which gives you an idea of just how badly this has gone wrong. I mean, the procedure of this is its policy missteps and broken promises. They've basically made really painful cuts to the welfare system. There's a deep loss of respect and trust because they just seem to be bad at the details of modern politics, like not having corruption scandals, or maybe actually just fully paying your taxes being an important issue if you're running on a clean hands campaign. There is an ongoing struggle for the hearts and minds of the Labour Party, and Starmer spearheaded an absolutely, savage crackdown against the Labour left, and it hasn't completely worked. And a large part, of course, of the Labour left has now broken away to form an own party. These were people that in many cases were expelled from the party and have now decided to form their own party. 49 Labour MPs voted against the government over welfare cuts. And as you say, there's a sort of strategic vacuum. I mean, you say that he's managerial and he doesn't have ideology. As somebody who has the misfortune of carrying a British passport, I disagree. I just think my friend David Edgerton put it well. He tells us he's a conservative. We should take him at his word. He's a conservative. Like, he's a flag-waving, small c British conservative with a sort of social democratic touch and a kind of workerist personal affect cut through by modern careerism and upward social mobility. But there's no point. I mean, why pretend otherwise? The message that's delivered is nationalist. It's a kind of small p populism. It's a large part really conniving, as you see in large parts of Europe, with the anti-immigrant agenda. It doesn't translate, unlike with New Labour, where you could, or both with Blair and Brown, where you could actually point to very substantial redistributive efforts and a serious effort, for instance, to deal with child poverty. We're not seeing that in this government. So what's gone wrong at a deeper level? I think there are three basic issues here. The first is the underlying economic problems are really serious. So the British economy has been growing appallingly slowly since 2008. The New Labour government basically rode, that is the government of the 90s and the 2000s, rode on the powerhouse of the City of London, which was broken irrevocably by the financial crisis of 2008. Then they gambled on connections to China, which didn't work out in the 2010s because of global geopolitics. And then Brexit put the nail in the coffin, really, of placing the UK outside the EU, and therefore it's no longer attractive as a major centre for foreign manufacturing, FDI, which for foreign direct investment, that had been a big thing. And then you add on that the nervousness in bond markets that was triggered by the ghastly moment of the Truss government and the moron premium that the British taxpayer has subsequently paid for the incredibly sort of just feckless management of public finance at that moment and the uncooperative relation of the Bank of England. That's one set of problems. Right, there you are. The new government, Labour government, comes in and it's already basically in a kind of beleaguered situation facing deep structural issues. And it's not easy to see how you maneuver your way out of that if you are going to persist with the claim that you're not going to raise taxes, which they promised, and you also aren't willing to take the risk of doing large-scale borrowing and investment. Problem number one. Problem number two is the Brexit demons are still on the loose in the form of the Reform Party, right? The generation of British democratic culture that was opened by the Brexit campaign and the lying, the post-truth, the pandering to the lowest common denominator of xenophobic nationalist conservatism, which is always a streak of British society, as it is in most societies around the world. And the fact that this was raised to the level of national politics is still there, and it's a huge dead weight on British democratic discourse, and the Labour Party is really responsive to it. And then the third element is that the Starmerites see themselves as, on a mission to purge the Labour Party of the demons of Corbynism and the accusations of anti-Semitism and the really perverse attachment of the British government to the defence of Israel since October 7th. Have compounded that. And in a society with a radicalized, democratically activated Muslim majority in many of urban areas, which in a first past the post system will result in parliamentarians being elected from those constituencies. It's a recipe for fragmentation rather than unification, and it's broken the integrity of the the Labour Party, and who knows where that goes. The new left-wing party that Sara Sultana and Corbyn have launched. There's a long tradition in British politics of those third, fourth, fifth party movements fizzling out. But those are the kind of constraints that Starmer's operating under. And so even if one sets aside just the pale mediocrity of the political class, the structural constraints are really serious.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, I do wonder whether Nigel Farage, the leader of the new Reform Party and the former cheerleader of Brexit, is in some sense the most significant political actor in Britain in historic terms in recent years. I mean, yeah, he's sort of been the one who seems to have shaped events perhaps more than anyone else, and now, as polls suggest, his Reform Party is leading the other parties in Britain. If there were an election today, it seems like Farage would be the new prime minister. It seems only fair to ask, what would that look like? I mean, what would the Reform Party's agenda look like if it were put into practice in Britain? And then in a more general sense, what exactly would be at stake in a global sense in this possibility, and the possibility of Britain just being run by a full-on populist party with a prime minister Farage. I mean, what would really be at stake there?
So there are three really, loudly articulated elements of the reform agenda. And they're, to anyone familiar with Trump politics, they're, the same old tune. The first is a massive coercive attack on the complicated, to a very large extent, successful patchwork of multi-ethnic, multicultural Britain. So the plan is to build huge prison detention centres with tens of thousands of places, and over the course of a parliament, which could be 4 to 5 years, to deport 600,000 people, which, scaled up is the sort of target which the Trump people are going for. And this isn't by accident. They're obviously mirroring it themselves. Then there is, again, an agenda of domestic public order, the idea that somehow Britain is a society convulsed by criminality, attributable, obviously, always in some sense to some other, which would be, black youth or migrants or deviants of some kind. There's a very, very close association. One of my favorite studies of the Brexit vote, which are Farage's people, is the close association between Brexit voting and the belief that the public flogging of sex offenders would be an appropriate kind of punishment to bring back. Like, this isn't the kind of politics that's limited to the United States or the right wing of the AFD. It's, it has its supporters in the UK. So what they want a 17 billion budget that's pounds for the police and 30,000 new police officers. And then, and this is the kind of hardcore of the economics program, they want a 12% cut to public spending and a similar cut to taxes. So this is the sort of hard right, neoliberal, kind of Milei, radical Thatcherite kind of element here. And Milei being the Argentinian equivalent of Farage. That's a 5% shift of the fiscal budget. That's the sort of number. The French are looking at a 2 to 3% shift in GDP, and that's breaking French politics. The Germans are looking at that kind of number in terms of additional spending, and what Farage wants to do is cut back the state by that amount. And then on top of that, you've got all of the usual noise. You've got anti-green at talking points, so they don't like windmills either, just like Trump, and they like crypto just like Trump, and they want to deregulate the City of London and concentrate regulatory power in the Bank of England. And, since their electorate is overwhelmingly undereducated, about 5% of university graduates voted for them in the most recent election in the UK, 25% of folks without college degrees. It's a party, obviously, that would push through a kind of anti-woke educational agenda in Britain. They want to teach a proud history of the British Empire. It's, yawningly predictable and ghastly. What would it actually do? Well, if they tried to do that fiscal program, good luck. Thatcher tried. She didn't manage to do it because, in fact, there are huge constituencies tied to public spending because it actually isn't unproductive and it's not bad for people. And the whole idea that, it is crazy. probably they would enact the tax cuts and probably not the spending cuts, and then you end up with large deficits, and we'd have to see how the Treasury market respond. That would depend very much on the Bank of England and whether the Bank of England was on side. Mark Carney, when he was running the Bank of England, absorbed the shock of the Brexit referendum and prevented a crisis. When Truss came along, the Bank of England didn't play ball and the Treasury market went into spasm. So it would be kind of interesting to see how the Bank of England played that out. The migrant pushbacks would be brutal for Britain's neighbours. They would have to figure out, though they don't like the idea, they'd have to figure out their politics with France. They've been talking to Albania. They envision Albania as a possible place, and Albania is one of the most fashionable parts of Europe. So I don't know whether they'd really play ball. Defence spending wise, Farage is not. He's not looking to do more than the NATO basics right now. So he's looking to increase spending on military to 2.5% of GDP in 3 years, 3% by 6 years. This is like the standard NATO alignment. How does Britain matter in the world right now? It's one of the European anchors of NATO, so it's pretty kind of conventional there. He'd be a kind of Maloney role. The City of London matters, and if you turned that into a sort of slightly roguish offshore financial centre, you might attract serious money. God only knows, Wall Street will go play. It's hard to see that this would be a game changer. After all, with Brexit, this is really just the following through of the shock that British politics did deliver, I think, to, global bien-pensant opinion that, a democracy could deliver a self-harming vote of quite that proportion was a shock. But that it could then go on to vote for Farage seems a little less surprising on balance, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the effects of that agenda would be horrific in Britain. I don't wish that to happen. But there is a sense in which I wonder, in just sort of hearing your description, whether it could be, beneficial for outsiders to almost have this laboratory where this horrific experiment is happening, and then it scares everyone else off from voting.
Certainly, that is what happened with Brexit.
That's right? What I mean.
Brexit ended the conversation, really, I think, about anyone. And it wasn't the immediate vote, because that didn't. It was the negotiation of the exit afterwards and the obviously negative long-run effects, right? Because Brexit didn't bring the house down immediately. But
apologies to our British listeners. I mean, for proposing this as a kind of, laboratory for the rest of the world. But at this point, as you said, it's just seeing through the project. Maybe that's what the rest of the world.
I mean, the other thing to say is that, I think that then be also questions about the integrity of the UK. I haven't thought this through to its end, but I mean, it's important to acknowledge that, Brexit was an English project. And for all of the Union Jack flag waving of both Starmer and Farage, the divides remain really pronounced. And Scotland is a much more European political economy. The same, I think, questions would also have to be asked about the long-run future of Northern Ireland. We hosted an event on Irish reunification, Columbia last academic year, which was absolutely fascinating. And I think the long-run future of the UK would also be put in question by the working through of this essentially right-wing nationalist Little England vision of Britain's future. And I'm not sure whether those other two major component parts would really be willing to follow through, because especially in Ireland, the stakes are quite high. Managing the delicate politics of the post-Troubles Irish political situation is not something you would want in the hands of Farage and his cohorts. Not that it was safe in the hands of the Tories, God help us, but I think this would be another, when you say this would be the continuation of the project, well, then I think we maybe have to think that thought to its conclusion. Can the delirium of English politics really suck the entire United Kingdom down this path, or might there be fragmentation then?
Well, that's a cheery thought to end on, I guess. It strikes me that you may potentially end up losing your British passport, not by virtue of sort of rescinding it or giving it up voluntarily, but maybe Britain doesn't exist anymore as a country and you'll have to exchange it for an English one at that point. But we should take a break here for now, and we'll be back, of course, as always, next week. Ones and Twos is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. and Ones and Two's listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Two's homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.